if time is not godly appropriated, the old Adam will not only stay in his Sunday clothes, but he'll stay in his everyday conduct. And it is for this purpose, church, are y'all with me? Jesus tells this parable in Luke chapter 12. It is for this purpose, as he shares with his listeners and us, to encourage the priority of being prepared and to warn of the consequences of being unprepared. That's what Luke chapter 12, verses 35 through 48 is really about. The lesson of the parable, as we know, as Jesus moved throughout his ministry, he constantly told several parables. Parable is a story, or a heavenly or earthly story, with a spiritual principle that undergirds it. Jesus tells this parable because, as you read, there are certain instances that are going on in the text, but when we get to verses 35 through 48, are y'all interested? As we get to verses 35 through 48, Jesus strategically tells this parable as he lifts up the importance for those who will come after him of understanding that the usage of your time will determine how God will find you. As a matter of fact, that's the sermon in the sentence. Let me give it to you. Preparation to meet God in eternity, church, requires one to value God's time on earth. If we're going to meet God in eternity, then you got to value God's time while you're here on planet Earth. Let me push that envelope a little further if I can. I'm going to take my time, y'all. Let me push that. Not only that, but meeting God in eternity requires one to spend time with him on earth. We can't meet God in eternity. You spend no time with him on earth. So this is the lesson of the parable, and Jesus tells this lesson. And in this parable, church, there are two perspectives that Jesus lifts up here, but there's only one principle to practice. There's two perspectives in the parable that he lifts up, and I'll show you that in a minute, but there's only one principle that Jesus hammers that must be practiced. The first principle, the first perspective in the parable is in verses 35 through 40. In that perspective, where Jesus is talking about the second coming of Christ. In this parable, he describes what the second coming of Christ would be like. But in the second perspective of this parable in Luke chapter 12, he talks about the call of God that enters into a man's life. God calls a man. That call enters into his life. When that call enters into a man's life, it's a call of preparation to one day meet God. So the first half of the parable, he's talking about the second coming of Christ, but in the latter part of the parable, of the text, he's talking about what we must do as a result of experiencing the call of God. Incidentally, church, there are four calls in life. God calls, there's the physical call where he calls us into life. We're born into the physical life. But then there's the call of the salvific life, that God calls us out of darkness. Somebody ought to say amen. He calls us out of darkness into his marvelous light. And that's the call that where we experience God like we've never experienced God. We stop doing the things that we used to do because he called us out of darkness. That's the spiritual call. But then God calls us into service. As he calls us out of darkness into his service, God enlists every child of God in his service. That's why we must work while it's day, for when night comes, no man can work. That's why he equips us, he gives us tools, he enables us to come to an understanding of how we are to serve in the church. Because that's the third call. He calls us into service. And then the final call, he calls us into death. That's when we must stand before God. No wonder Moses writes in Psalm 90, verse 12, so teach us to number our days that we might apply our hearts to wisdom, because one day we got to check out of here. We're going to have to stand before God and give an account of the service that we rendered while we were here on earth. Do I have a witness? And so the second perspective of this parable in chapter 12, Christ is explaining what we ought to be doing when Christ calls, when we experience the call of God in service, making preparation to meet God one day.